Every major cattle town in the Wild West had a law banning firearms within city limits. You checked your guns at the edge of town the way you check a coat at a restaurant. And the most famous gunfight in American history began because a group of men decided that particular rule did not apply to them. That was not a showdown between good and evil. That was a weapons ordinance falling apart in real time. Welcome to Coyote Territory. Subscribe and drop a comment below if you can. Now, let us talk about how order actually worked out here. You think you know the Wild West sheriff. You have seen him 100 times, standing alone in a dirt street, one hand loose at his side, the whole town frozen behind closed shutters, waiting to see who draws first. That image sold a lot of movie tickets. It has almost nothing to do with how frontier towns actually survived. The men who held these places together were not gunslingers. They were strategists, ward politicians, and crowd managers who understood something the films never figured out. A town that reaches the point of a gunfight has already failed. The real job was making sure it never got there. And the most effective lawmen out here drew their revolvers last, not first, and spent the majority of their careers making sure no one else ever had a reason to draw at all. Understanding how one man could control an entire town full of armed, exhausted, and frequently drunk cattle drivers means starting not with a six-shooter, but with a city ordinance. Abilene, Kansas, 1870. The cattle drives are arriving from Texas, and so is everything that comes with them. Thousands of longhorn cattle and the men who pushed them 800 miles north through heat, river crossings, and the constant threat of a stampede. They arrive dirty, saddle-worn, and ready to spend. And they are all carrying firearms, every single one of them. This is not a generalization. It is a practical fact of trail life. A cowboy on the Chisholm Trail could not afford to be unarmed. Rattlesnakes, bandits, wolves, and the occasional dispute over grazing made a revolver a tool of basic survival, not a fashion statement. What works on an open plains trail becomes a different problem entirely when you set it down inside a town of 2,000 people. Abilene grasped this quickly. The city passed an ordinance requiring visitors to check their firearms at the edge of town or at designated points inside it. The rule was practical, not philosophical. You could have your weapons back when you left. In the meantime, you were a civilian. Wichita followed with its own ordinance in 1872. Dodge City, which would become the most storied of all the Kansas cattle towns, banned the carry of firearms within the deadline, a marked line through town, by 1876. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, passed a similar ordinance in 1880. The requirement was everywhere, enforced with varying levels of consistency, but consistently on the books. You checked your guns the way you would check a coat at a restaurant. The expectation was compliance. Most people complied. The ones who did not are the ones who ended up in the history books. October 26, 1881. Tombstone, Arizona Territory. You have likely heard of this date. The gunfight at the OK Corral is the most mythologized event in Western American history. It has been filmed, novelized, performed, and debated for more than 140 years. What it is almost never described as is what it actually was: a weapons compliance incident that escalated past the point of no return. Tombstone's City Ordinance No. 9, passed in 1880, required visitors to deposit firearms with law enforcement upon entering town. The Clanton brothers and the McLaury brothers had been inside Tombstone that day and had not complied. Wyatt Earp, who held the position of Tombstone's town marshal and was therefore the man responsible for enforcing that ordinance, went to address it. He brought his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, and he brought Doc Holliday. What happened in that vacant lot near Fremont Street lasted approximately 30 seconds. 3 men were dead. Strip away the mythology, and you have a marshal attempting to enforce a weapons ordinance against men who had decided not to follow it, and the situation escalating beyond recovery. The drama was real. The stakes were real. But the cause of it was not a romantic contest between good and evil. It was a dispute about whether 4 men were going to hand over their guns. The fact that this dispute ended the way it did only underscores how unusual that outcome was, because the entire architecture of frontier law enforcement was built around making sure it never reached that point. Which brings you to the mechanics of the job itself. The first thing you need to understand is that the sheriff in most Western territories was not appointed. He was elected. This is not a minor administrative detail. It means the man carrying the badge had to campaign for it, earn votes, manage political relationships, and remain accountable to a constituency in the most direct possible sense. If the merchants decided he was too aggressive and driving away business, they could vote him out at the end of the term. If the ranchers believed he was too soft on rustling, same result. The job required the political instincts of a ward boss as much as it required anything else. A fast draw that alienated the wrong faction of voters was a career-ending fast draw. The salary reflected both the responsibility and the politics. A county sheriff in the 1870s and 80s typically earned between $100 and $150 per month in base pay, which was a solid wage for the era, but not a fortune. The meaningful income came from fees. Most jurisdictions entitled the sheriff to a set amount for each arrest made, each warrant served, each prisoner transported to a distant court. This created a financial incentive that shaped how the work got done. Volume mattered. Efficiency mattered. A sheriff who processed arrests cleanly and maintained the paperwork correctly was a sheriff who earned more money and kept fewer headaches out of the territorial courts. Deputies worked on essentially the same model, often paid per arrest rather than on a fixed salary. This meant the structure of frontier law enforcement was, in its own way, acutely results-oriented. You were paid for outcomes, not hours. A deputy who understood the territory, cultivated informants, and made clean arrests earned a living. A deputy who spent his time posturing in saloon doorways earned almost nothing and was eventually replaced. A competent sheriff allocated his people accordingly. You put the men who were skilled at de-escalation working the saloon district on payday nights. You made sure a physically imposing presence was visible at the cattle pens when a new drive rolled in, because 30 seconds of visual deterrence cost nothing and sometimes saved a great deal. You kept your most methodical deputy on warrant administration because a procedural error could void an arrest and release the man you just risked your safety to bring in. You thought in systems, not in confrontations. None of this resembles the lone hero of the Western film. It resembles department management. The man who understood these mechanics better than almost anyone else operating in the West during this period stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, was ambidextrous with a revolver, could not read a single word of English, and over a career spanning 32 years, made approximately 3,000 arrests. He worked a territory larger than most eastern states, pursued men who had every reason to resist, and was shot at far more times than he could count. He walked away from every one of those encounters without a serious wound. His name was Bass Reeves. Reeves was born into slavery in Crawford County, Arkansas in 1838. During the Civil War, he escaped north into Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma. He spent years there, living among the Cherokee and Creek nations, and in that time, he learned things that would later make him the most effective lawman on the frontier. He learned the terrain, the river crossings, the routes a man might take if he needed to disappear. He learned several of the languages spoken in the territory. He learned how communities in Indian Territory worked and how trust was built inside them. When the federal government began staffing the Western District of Arkansas with deputy marshals in 1875, Judge Isaac Parker hired Bass Reeves as one of the first black deputy marshals west of the Mississippi. What followed was 32 years of work that should be better known than it is. Reeves could not read. He made this into a system rather than a disadvantage. When he was issued a warrant, someone read it to him once. He memorized it. Not a rough outline, the actual content. Names, physical descriptions, last known whereabouts, charges, the specific legal language of the document. He carried those details in his head with the reliability of a filing cabinet, and he served those warrants across a jurisdiction of 75,000 square miles of rough country with inadequate roads and men who very much did not want to be found. He used disguises to a degree that no other frontier lawman of the era documented as thoroughly. He arrived at farms and outlaw camps as a drifter looking for work, a traveling preacher, a farmhand needing a meal, a fellow fugitive on the run. He cultivated informants across the territory over years, building a network of people who knew where wanted men were and who trusted Reeves enough, or feared the alternative enough, to share that information. He planned his approaches the way a careful man plans a difficult negotiation, not the way a man plans a fight. By the time the person he was after knew Bass Reeves was there, the moment for resistance was usually already gone. In 32 years of documented service, Bass Reeves is recorded to have killed 14 men in the line of duty. His hat brim was shot away during one encounter. A bullet cut through his belt during another. His horse's bridle was struck during a third. He continued working after each of these. He requested no special recognition for any of them, as far as the record shows, and the record on Reeves is more complete than you might expect, because Judge Parker's court in Fort Smith kept detailed documentation. In 1902, Reeves arrested his own son, Benny Reeves, for the murder of Benny's wife. He requested the case from the court. He served the warrant himself. Benny was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, later receiving a partial pardon after serving a portion of that sentence. Bass Reeves did not discuss this publicly in any account that survives. He continued working. By the time he retired in 1910, 3,000 people had passed through the legal system because of Bass Reeves. He died later that same year of Bright's disease, a kidney condition. He was 71 years old. He had never been defeated in court by a single one of the 3,000 cases he brought forward. Now, Wyatt Earp. The popular version of Wyatt Earp is a man defined entirely by the 30 seconds on October 26, 1881. The actual Wyatt Earp was a businessman who periodically took law enforcement positions when they served his financial and political interests, and who understood the cattle town economy well enough to make himself useful in both capacities simultaneously. Earp's primary income sources throughout his career were not his badge. He dealt faro, which was the dominant card game in Western saloons during the 1870s and 80s. He held partial ownership in gambling operations in both Dodge City and Tombstone. He invested in real estate. He entered into business arrangements with saloon owners in the towns where he worked. In Dodge City, where he served as a deputy marshal between 1876 and 1879, his role was less about heroics than about keeping the cattle season running profitably for the merchants and gambling establishments whose economic activity made the town what it was. He understood something that the Hollywood version of him never fully conveys. The goal of cattle town law enforcement during the summer season was not to eliminate danger. It was to prevent danger from becoming catastrophic. Cattle season brought enormous economic activity. The merchants needed the cowboys to spend their wages. The saloon owners needed tables full of players. The hotels needed the beds filled and the dining rooms turning over. Violence interrupted all of this, and interrupted commerce meant interrupted political support, and interrupted political support meant the next election became a problem. So Earp and the men working beside him developed a style of crowd management that a modern security professional would find more recognizable than a Western screenwriter would. You identified the genuinely volatile individuals early and made those men aware of your presence before anything happened. You leveraged your reputation to dissolve confrontations before they formed. You kept the streets visible enough that most trouble never materialized because the men thinking about causing it could see that the calculation did not work in their favor. And when you did have to physically intervene, you moved fast and definitively, because a drawn-out physical struggle in a crowded saloon was chaos, and chaos was expensive for everyone involved, including the lawmen, whose job depended on voters who owned those saloons. This is why the firearms ordinance was the foundation of the entire system. If you could establish at the edge of town that visitors were expected to comply with local law, and that compliance was in fact going to be enforced, you had already won the essential battle. An unarmed drunk causes a brawl. An armed drunk, under the wrong circumstances, causes something that ends careers, bankrupts saloons, and creates paperwork that takes months to resolve. The ordinance was not moral philosophy, it was loss prevention. And here is where the numbers become the argument. Between 1870 and 1885, the 5 major Kansas cattle towns, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge City, and Caldwell, recorded a combined total of 45 homicides. 45, across 5 towns, across 15 years. That is an average of 3 homicides per town over the entire period. Roughly 1 death every 5 years in each of the most famous, most mythologized frontier boom towns in American history. Consider the conditions those numbers describe. These towns were at the end of the largest cattle drives on the continent during their peak years. Abilene alone received more than 500,000 longhorn cattle during the 1871 season. The population of each town swelled significantly during cattle season, with thousands of men who had spent months on the trail and arrived carrying weapons, wages, and a fully understandable interest in everything they had been doing without. By the logic of the Hollywood Western, the streets should have run red from April through September every year. What they actually produced was 45 deaths across 5 towns across 15 years. That is the achievement of frontier law enforcement that never appears in the films. The films show you the confrontations. The actual record shows you the absences. The shootings that did not happen. The men who handed over their guns at the deadline and went to a saloon and played cards and went to sleep and rode out the next morning without incident. The warrants that Bass Reeves served through a combination of planning, reputation, and the element of surprise, without a shot fired on either side. The cattle seasons that ended without a catastrophe because the men running the law had thought carefully about how to prevent one. Drop a comment below and tell us whether the real frontier lawman deserves more credit than the Hollywood version has ever bothered to give him. We read every one. The final piece of this picture runs through all of it, and it is the piece that is hardest to dramatize. Reputation. In a place where communication moved slowly, where a wanted man could cover 200 miles in a week and vanish into open country, a lawman's reputation was infrastructure. It traveled faster than he did. It arrived in a town before he got there. And reputation, for the men who built it effectively, was not built on the number of men they had faced in the street. It was built on consistency, on showing up, on being predictable in the right ways. The most effective frontier lawmen were the ones who were present before things went wrong, rather than after. They walked the saloon district on Friday nights and knew which strangers were in town and what they were there for. They maintained working relationships with bartenders, hotel clerks, and stable hands who saw everything and who, if treated with basic professional respect, would let the marshal know when something felt wrong before it became a problem he had to solve with force. They understood that a town was a system of relationships, and that maintaining those relationships was the majority of the job. The part that made the newspapers was the other 10%. What the real history of frontier law enforcement tells you is something the entire mythology was constructed to hide. The Wild West was chaotic, in the way that any rapidly developing place is chaotic, with thin legal infrastructure, inconsistent authority, and enormous economic pressure bearing down on people with very little margin for error. But the people who lived in it were not waiting for a lone hero to ride in and solve their problems by shooting faster than the other man. They were passing ordinances, running elections, building courthouses, and hiring professionals to do a complicated and often thankless job with the tools available. The man who controlled a frontier town was not the one who could outshoot everyone in it. He was the man everyone else had agreed to let do the controlling. That agreement, renewed every day and ratified in every election, was the actual foundation of order on the frontier. Take the agreement away, and the fastest draw in Kansas is just a man standing in a street. Bass Reeves memorized 3,000 warrants and served them all. The towns passed their ordinances, and most people complied. The sheriffs got themselves elected and then got themselves re-elected by doing the work well enough that the voters saw no reason to change course. The gunfight was the failure. The law was the whole point.